July 12th, 1964. Vidalia, Louisiana. 25-year-old Joseph Joe Ed Edwards is seen leaving his place of employment, the Shamrock Motel. An eyewitness later sees Joe Ed's vehicle pulled over by the side of the highway, and 3 white males in what appears to be an unmarked police car are at the scene. Joe Ed is never heard from again, and his abandoned vehicle is discovered 1 week later. As the years go by, rumors circulate that Joe Ed was the victim of a hate crime, possibly because he attempted to kiss a white woman. Some local police officers and members of the Ku Klux Klan are suspected of being responsible for Joe Ed's disappearance, but no one is ever charged, and no trace of him is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we'll be covering an older missing persons case which might be one of the most horrific crimes we've ever done, the 1964 disappearance of Joseph Edwards. As you already know, due to the events which are taking place in the world right now, I have decided that every episode that The Trail Went Cold releases over the course of the next month will cover an unsolved cold case in which the victims were persons of color. One of the biggest issues that the world is dealing with at the moment is law enforcement and their treatment of minorities, and this is a civil rights era story from the South about a young African-American man who went missing, and it's strongly suspected that racist police officers affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan were complicit in what happened. The victim in question was Joseph Edwards, who went by the nickname Joe Ed, and what's particularly interesting is that he vanished only 10 days after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law, so racial tensions were high in the area where Joe Ed lived. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the story of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American who was brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955 after he was accused of making advances towards a white woman. When Joe Ed went missing, there were a number of different rumors which circulated, and one of the most prominent is that he was targeted because he attempted to kiss a white woman. But there's so much unconfirmed hearsay and contradictory statements surrounding this case that no one knows the full truth about what happened. Even though the FBI did perform an investigation in the years following Joe Ed's disappearance, his story was pretty much forgotten until Stanley Nelson, the editor of the Concordial Sentinel newspaper, published a series of extensive articles about the case 4 decades later. The investigation was reopened, but in the end, there were no conclusive answers, so we're going to do our own in-depth exploration into this case on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Joseph Edwards. Our story begins in 1964, and our central figure is a 25-year-old African-American man named Joseph Edwards, who goes by the nickname Joe Ed. Originally born in Adams County, Mississippi, Joe Ed hails from a large family and has a total of 11 siblings. He was pretty much raised by his grandparents, who moved across the state line to Concordia Parish, Louisiana, while he was in his teens. The area borders the Mississippi River, and local residents often use a pair of twin bridges to travel back and forth between the towns of Vidalia, Louisiana, and Natchez, Mississippi. Even though Joe Ed often visits family members, including his mother, in Natchez, he spends most of his time living with his grandparents at their home along Louisiana Highway 900. Joe Ed is also currently engaged to a woman named Ogre Taylor, who lives in Jackson, Mississippi, though they often visit each other. The couple have 2 children together and are planning to get married sometime in the near future. At the moment, Joe Ed has spent the past month employed as a porter and a handyman at the Shamrock Motel in Vidalia. Shortly after midnight on Sunday, July the 12th, a kitchen worker at the Shamrock would claim she saw Joe Ed leaving even though he was not scheduled to work that night. He drove away in his 1958 Buick, a vehicle he had purchased only 6 days earlier, but he did not return home, and this would turn out to be the last time he was confirmed to be alive. After not seeing him for a week, Joe Ed's mother contacted both the Vidalia and Natchez police departments in order to report him missing. Around the same time, Joe Ed's family was informed that his abandoned Buick had been discovered in the town of Faraday on Green Acres Road, a street which was located on the west side of the Dixie Lanes bowling alley. After the Concordia Parish Sheriff's Office received a complaint about it, they arranged for the vehicle to be towed to a local service station, and one of Joe Ed's sisters would later say that when the family went to examine it, they found a necktie hanging over the rearview mirror and a belt on the seat, but they did not believe that either of these items belonged to Joe Ed. There would be a lot of confusion about the discovery of the Buick, as throughout the previous week, a number of eyewitnesses would report having seen it parked on the north side of Faraday-Vidalia Highway before it was somehow moved to Green Acres Road. During that time period, some people had checked inside the car while it was parked, and even though there didn't appear to be any bloodstains in there by the time it was towed to the service station, one witness did recall seeing what appeared to be a silver dollar-sized blood spot on the floor under the steering wheel, and at least 2 other eyewitnesses remembered seeing mud inside the car. There were also witnesses who reported having seen the necktie on the steering wheel in the shape of a noose. The reports of the Buick being parked next to the highway seemed to be corroborated by Kenneth Stevenson, the manager of the Dixie Lanes bowling alley. At around 1:30 a.m. on July the 12th, about an hour and a half after Joe Ed was last seen, Stevenson claimed he was driving down the Faraday-Vidalia Highway when he saw Joe Ed's Buick pulled over by the side of the road with a white 1964 Oldsmobile parked behind it. While the Oldsmobile appeared to have a red dashboard light and 2 rear antennae, there was no law enforcement insignia to indicate it was a police car. Stevenson said he saw an overweight white man sitting in the Oldsmobile driver's seat, and 2 other white males were standing next to the Buick's open driver's side door. However, Stevenson did not get a good look at the Buick's driver, and while he appeared to be wearing a green sports shirt, Stevenson could not tell what race the driver was, and was unable to confirm or deny if it was Joe Ed. Shortly thereafter, the Oldsmobile caught up to Stevenson's car and passed him by. Stevenson claimed that he did not recognize any of the white males he saw, though he said they were all dressed in civilian clothing. It would later turn out that the only law enforcement agency who would have been using a 1964 Oldsmobile with 2 rear antennae was the Vidalia Police Department, as they had recently leased one from an auto dealership. Contrary to Stevenson's description, this Oldsmobile had a red light on top instead of on the dashboard, though the department also carried their own portable flashing red emergency light which they could mount on their dash. However, when Stevenson was shown a photograph of the department's vehicle, he did not believe it was the same Oldsmobile he saw. Joe Ed's family started hearing rumors that he was being held in a jail in Faraday, but they could not get any of the local law enforcement agencies to cooperate with them or show much effort to find Joe Ed. As a result, the family decided to contact the Department of Justice, who subsequently turned the case over to the FBI. Since Joe Ed technically went missing in Louisiana, the investigation would be handled by the New Orleans division of the FBI. One agent would later recall meeting Joe Ed's mother in his office when she officially reported him missing, and one of the first things she said was, quote-unquote, "The Klan got my boy." Concerns were high because Joe Ed just happened to go missing only 10 days after a landmark moment in the history of the United States. On July the 2nd, President Lyndon B. Johnson officially signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, and would allow schools and public facilities to be integrated. Needless to say, this news was not received well in Concordia Parish and the surrounding area, as racism was still very prevalent there, and its courts and law enforcement were staffed exclusively by whites. Between 1964 and 1967, Concordia Parish had at least 14 known racially motivated murders, some of which I'll talk about later, and there very well may have been more murders which were never even recorded. Anyway, during the initial stages of their investigation, the FBI contacted all the local law enforcement agencies and were able to determine that Joe Ed was not being held in jail anywhere. But right from the outset, there was genuine fear that someone from law enforcement had been responsible for his disappearance. The person who arranged for Joe Ed's Buick to be towed from Green Acres Road to the service station was Frank DeLauder, a deputy with the Concordia Parish Sheriff's Office. Nicknamed Big Frank DeLaw, DeLauder was a large, imposing figure who was highly feared by the African American community and had a reputation for beating and brutally torturing black suspects when he had them in custody. Well, Joe Ed's first cousin, Carl Ray Thompson, would find out about this firsthand. The two men had a very close relationship, and Joe Ed pretty much considered Carl Ray to be his best friend. In the days following Joe Ed's disappearance, Carl Ray and 3 other African American friends of his were picked up by DeLauder and another Concordia Parish Sheriff's deputy named Howard Bill Ogden. They were all suspected of having broken into a store and committing theft, but even though Carl Ray would later acknowledge that his 3 friends had told him they were going to do this, he denied ever having taken part in the theft. The 4 men were held overnight in the county jail, and while Carl Ray said he was never personally assaulted himself, he witnessed DeLauder and Ogden interrogate and brutally beat his 3 friends with a fire hose. The following morning, the suspects were being transferred to the Concordia Parish Jail in DeLauder's patrol car when they happened to pass by Joe Ed's abandoned Buick, which had not yet been found at this point. DeLauder asked the men if any of them knew Joe Ed, and when one of them pointed to Carl Ray, DeLauder warned him that if anyone spoke about what happened in the city jail, he would, quote-unquote, teach them a lesson, and they'd all wind up missing like Joe Ed. The men were later released without charge, but Carl Ray would hear rumors that Joe Ed had been murdered, and his body was placed in a large bar pit located near Lake St. John, just outside of Faraday, which was now filled with water and debris and often used as a fishing hole. In spite of these rumors, the FBI were unable to make much headway with finding Joe Ed, and their brief investigation would hit a standstill. However, when the FBI returned to the area in August of 1967 to investigate a separate murder, they would learn new information about Joe Ed's case, which prompted them to perform a more extensive investigation in which they interviewed over 250 witnesses. One of the FBI's informants was E.D. Morris, a member of the Ku Klux Klan who lived in Faraday, and he told them that a fellow Klansman named Kenneth Norman Head had admitted to his involvement in the murder of Joseph Edwards. Head was a member of a local militant offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan known as the Silver Dollar Group. The group was reportedly put together during the spring of 1964 by a man named Raleigh Jackson Glover, nicknamed Red, who felt that many factions of the KKK had become too passive, so he was dedicated to using violent resistance to combat the civil rights movement by any means possible. The Silver Dollar Group earned its nickname because Glover would give each new member who joined a silver dollar with their date of birth engraved on it as a sign of unity. Glover, Head, and another member named Homer Thomas Buck Horton were known for working together as a quote-unquote hit squad to perpetuate acts of violence, and they also served as members of the Vidalia Auxiliary Police Force. They apparently took great pride in their reputation for being the meanest Klansmen in the region. What was notable is that in the months prior to Joe Ed's disappearance, Glover had originally formed the Silver Dollar Group during a meeting at the cafe located at Joe Ed's place of employment, the Shamrock Motel, which was known for being one of the group's hangouts during that time period. According to E.D. Morris, Head had made a drunken confession about an incident which took place at the Shamrock and paved the way for Joe Ed's murder. Indeed, throughout the course of their investigation, the FBI would hear a number of different rumors that Joe Ed's disappearance was the result of his involvement with a white woman. In fact, Joe Ed's own cousin, Carl Ray Thompson, would concede that even though Joe Ed was engaged to a black woman at this time, Joe Ed admitted that he had a white girlfriend at the Shamrock. Since he worked as a porter, Joe Ed had a key to all the rooms and would tell Carl Ray about an incident where some white men had caught him inside one of the rooms with a woman, and the only reason he was not harmed is because she threatened to tell on the men if they went that far. Carl Ray warned Joe Ed against getting involved with white women and begged him to quit his job at the motel, and later said that he stopped going anywhere in public with Joe Ed for fear that he might become a victim himself. There were also rumors that Joe Ed was meeting a white woman at the Shamrock on the night he went missing. In fact, earlier that same evening, Joe Ed had frequented a bar owned by his fiance's father and supposedly told him that he was planning to pick up a white woman at the Shamrock before he left at 10:30 p.m. Joe Ed was reportedly seen arriving there and entering a room at around 11 o'clock, but even though the FBI interviewed his female co-workers and a number of other white women from the area, they all denied that they had planned to meet Joe Ed that night. Another prevalent rumor which circulated is that the Shamrock also functioned as a brothel and that Joe Ed would pimp out women to the customers. One story was that he was paid $5 tips in order to travel across the Mississippi River and transport sex workers from another prominent brothel in Natchez in order to deliver them to clients at the Shamrock. On June the 27th, there was a tragic incident at the motel in which a 4-year-old white boy accidentally drowned in the pool. There are many different versions of what actually happened, but in one of them, Joe Ed jumped into the pool in an attempt to rescue the child, but nearly drowned himself and had to be saved by the child's mother. As for the mother, she was known for being a sex worker, and one of the most prominent rumors was that she had left her child unattended in order to have sex with Joe Ed in one of the motel rooms. However, there were a number of eyewitness accounts which seemed to contradict this story, as some people claimed the mother was at the pool area when the child fell into the water, while other witnesses said they saw her filling up her truck when this happened. It must be mentioned that the rumors about Joe Ed being involved in a prostitution ring and having sexual relations with the child's mother were based on nothing more than hearsay and could not be corroborated, though this woman apparently told the FBI that her current husband, who happened to be the child's stepfather, had, quote-unquote, made several prostitution dates for her through Joe Ed. However, some people suspected that the individuals behind Joe Ed's disappearance may have spread false rumors in order to smear his reputation. The rumor which seemed to gain the most traction in the area was that Joe Ed was murdered for grabbing and attempting to kiss a white female coworker. On July the 9th, 3 days before he disappeared, Joe Ed reportedly made advances on Iona Perry, a 23-year-old registration clerk and telephone operator at the Shamrock, who also suffered from polio, which required her to use braces and crutches to get around. Perry was in the midst of an affair with a 44-year-old probation officer named James Buford Goss, who worked in the town of Tallulah, but passed through Vidalia as part of his job and stayed at the Shamrock at least once a week. Goss also happened to be married, though Perry claimed she did not know this at the time. When Perry told Goss about the kissing incident, Goss reportedly became so angry that he went to the Shamrock to look for Joe Ed with the intention of beating him up, but could not find him. The following day, Goss registered a complaint with Johnny Lee Bud Spinks, the Vidalia police chief and town marshal, in hopes of getting Joe Ed charged with assault. When Spinks paid Iona Perry a visit, she told him she did not want to press charges, but Perry would later tell the FBI that when Spinks was leaving, he assured her that Joe Ed, quote-unquote, would be taken care of. During their reinvestigation, the FBI interviewed a witness who had once worked as a civil deputy with the Concordia Parish Sheriff's Office. He claimed that when he told Frank DeLauder about having seen Joe Ed's abandoned Buick on Green Acres Road, DeLauder used a racial slur to describe Joe Ed and said he had, quote-unquote, smarted off to the girls at the Shamrock and they wouldn't be bothered with him anymore. Now, even though the overweight man that Kenneth Stevenson saw in the driver's seat of the Oldsmobile parked near the Buick matched the description of DeLauder, Stevenson did not know DeLauder personally and was certain this man was not him. A local reverend would also share an odd story with the FBI, claiming that Deputy Bill Ogden had once admitted to him that he and DeLauder pulled over the Buick for a traffic stop on the Faraday-Vidalia Highway that night. However, Ogden claimed that Joe Ed bolted from the vehicle and ran down the Mississippi River levee, and even though he and DeLauder gave chase, they were unable to catch Joe Ed and had no idea what happened to him. Over the years, a number of rumors would circulate throughout the area about the circumstances of how Joe Ed was murdered, and many of them were truly horrific. One rumor was that Joe Ed had been shot over 30 times by the Ku Klux Klan, who covered his body in concrete and threw him into the Mississippi River. Another one was that the KKK had taken Joe Ed somewhere to be whipped, but overdid it and wound up killing him before they disposed of his body. The FBI also heard that Joe Ed had been taken to a quote-unquote Klan torture chamber, and to their shock, they would discover an abandoned farmhouse which contained a number of disturbing items, including a rack which was covered in blood, and some thick, blood-stained items known as beansteaks, which were reportedly used to whip people. Perhaps the most disturbing rumor which spread was that Joe Ed had been hung up inside a barn and skinned alive before he was shot and his body was wrapped in chains and thrown into the river. One of the FBI agents who heard this story decided to contact a physician to find out if skinning a person alive was physically possible, and the physician told him that it could be done by someone who was very skilled with a knife, though there would be a lot of blood. The FBI would learn that in the fall of 1964, a commercial fisherman had gotten his net caught on what appeared to be an icebox which was submerged in Deer Park Lake, located about 15 miles south of Vidalia. The icebox was brought to the surface, and a couple pounds worth of what was described as dark brown, quote-unquote, flesh-like matter suddenly popped out and gave off a very rancid odor. Fearing that the flesh might be human, the fisherman decided to take a small sample to the Catahoula Parish Sheriff's Office, where a deputy placed it inside a refrigerator. When the FBI attempted to follow up on this, the Sheriff's Office no longer had the flesh-like material in their possession, though the consensus seemed to be that they may have determined it was nothing more than an animal carcass and threw it away. A local cafe from the area was known for using poached deer meat to make sausages, so there was speculation that they may have disposed of some of the illegal deer remains by dumping them in the lake. Even so, the FBI decided to perform a scuba diving operation at Deer Park Lake, but were unable to find the icebox or any other evidence. They failed to turn up any conclusive answers of what actually happened to Joe Ed, and ultimately brought an end to the investigation after 9 months. The case would pretty much languish in obscurity for the next 4 decades, but in 2007, Stanley Nelson, the editor of the Concordial Sentinel newspaper, decided to re-examine the story and perform a new investigation. This involved reviewing the FBI's original 620-page case file and interviewing and re-interviewing a number of witnesses, some of whom were never spoken to by the authorities at all during the 1960s. Over the course of the next 3 years, Nelson published a series of articles about the case, which caught the attention of the Cold Case Justice Initiative at the Syracuse College of Law, which sought to re-examine unsolved, racially motivated murders from the civil rights era. Around this time period, Congress passed the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act of 2007, which authorized the reopening of cold cases involving the murders of African American victims, which took place before 1970. Thanks to the new publicity surrounding Joe Ed's case, it soon wound up in the hands of the Department of Justice and the FBI, who once again reopened a new investigation. After working on it for years, the DOJ finally made a formal announcement in 2013 in which they stated that based on a thorough review of the evidence, they were now going to publicly name 7 individuals whom they believed were likely involved in Joseph Edwards' disappearance. They suspected that the whole thing was set in motion when James Buford Goss reported the alleged kissing incident with Iona Perry to the Vidalia Police Department. When Perry declined to press charges, Police Chief Bud Spinks contacted the Silver Dollar Group and enlisted the help of Red Glover, Buck Horton, and Kenneth Norman Head to seek revenge on Joe Ed. Since Concordia Parish deputies Frank DeLauder and Bill Ogden were also members of the group, they were likely brought in to assist as well. At some point, these individuals conspired to murder Joe Ed and dispose of his body. However, the exact circumstances of how these events played out could not be determined. By this point, all 7 of these named individuals were deceased, so even though Joe Ed was technically still a missing person, the DOJ felt like there was nothing more that could be done and officially closed the investigation. A letter of closure was sent by the DOJ to one of Joe Ed's surviving sisters, which read, quote, "Ultimately, the exhaustive investigation and review did not definitely determine what happened to your brother," end quote. Unfortunately, no trace of Joseph Edwards has ever been found, and the full truth about what caused his disappearance remains unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Anyway, this is really the first time I've ever broached the subject of civil rights era murders on The Trail Went Cold, and this is far from the only racially motivated crime from that time period which is still unsolved today. And sadly, in a number of those cases, it seems like it was pretty much an open secret throughout the community about who was responsible, but the local residents who wanted justice were powerless to do anything. But of all these stories, the main reason I decided to select Joseph Edwards as the subject of today's episode is because I originally came across it while researching an article I wrote for listverse.com several years ago, and it's always stuck with me. If you do a search for Joseph Edwards online, the only photograph you'll find of him is a very faded black and white one, but we're pretty much lucky to have that. When Stanley Nelson started writing his series of articles for the Concordial Sentinel in 2007, he learned that all existing photos of Joe Ed were confiscated from his grandparents' home by sheriff's deputies shortly after he went missing. It was not until one of Joe Ed's sisters found an old negative she had been storing of her brother that this one surviving photograph could be developed for publication. But that just shows how close this man came to being lost to history. As horrible as many of the other civil rights murders are, at least the victims' families had a body and could give them a proper burial, but Joe Ed is still technically a missing person, and his surviving relatives are left with nothing more than a series of horrific, unconfirmed rumors about what may or may not have happened to him. I mentioned earlier that the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act of 2007 paved the way for a number of these cases being reopened, though one of the biggest obstacles to solving them was that suspects and key witnesses were often long dead. But there were a few success stories. If you heard Season 3 of the Canadian true crime podcast, Someone Knows Something, you're probably familiar with the murders of Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Moore. They were both 19-year-old African-American men who were abducted and brutally tortured on May 2, 1964, before they were weighed down and thrown into the Mississippi River to drown while they were still alive. The crime took place in Franklin County, Mississippi, only about a half-hour's drive away from Concordia Parish, and in a cruel twist of fate, the victims' bodies would each be discovered on July the 12th and 13th, the same time that Joe Ed went missing. Well, in 2007, a suspect named James Ford Seal was charged, convicted, and received 3 life sentences for his role in this crime before he died in prison a few years later. While I don't see any indication that Seal had any personal involvement with this particular case, he was a member of the Silver Dollar Group, the same militant offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan who are believed to be responsible for murdering Joe Ed. Now, this case is a bit different than your average story on The Trail Went Cold, because there really isn't much of a mystery about what happened. It's pretty obvious that Joe Ed was abducted and murdered by racists who disposed of his body somewhere, and I think it's a given that the Silver Dollar Group was involved. The details which remain murky, however, is what specific individuals were involved, and what was the inciting incident which prompted them to commit this crime. Well, before we delve any further into Joe Ed's disappearance, we should talk about some other unsolved civil rights era murders which are believed to be connected to the Silver Dollar Group and may involve some of the same individuals from this case. During the early morning hours of December the 10th, 1964, Frank Morris, the 51-year-old African-American owner of a shoe repair shop in Faraday, Louisiana, was awakened by a loud noise and went outside to see two white males standing near the entrance to his shop. One of them was carrying a shotgun, and the other was carrying a can of gasoline, and they forced Morris back into his shop at gunpoint before setting it on fire. Morris was somehow still alive when he was rushed to the hospital, even though the only place on his body which did not have third-degree burns were the bottoms of his feet. He soon fell into a coma and died 4 days later. The case was never officially solved, though the Silver Dollar Group was believed to be responsible, and when the FBI performed an investigation in 1967, they turned up 4 promising suspects, one of whom was E.D. Morris, the same KKK informant who provided information to them about Joe Ed's case. It was also believed that the Concordia Parish Sheriff's Office were complicit in this crime, and that deputies Frank DeLauder and Bill Ogden intimidated witnesses into staying silent and leaving town. Much like with Joe Ed's case, rumors started to circulate that Morris was killed because he liked to flirt and carry on affairs with white women, but since he had such a stellar reputation in the community, many people were skeptical and believed that these false rumors were spread by his enemies in order to smear his reputation. In actuality, the real reason this crime may have been set in motion was because Frank DeLauder became angry over Morris's refusal to repair his cowboy boots without payment in advance. The racially motivated murder, which led to the FBI reinvestigating Joe Ed's case, took place in Natchez, Mississippi on February the 27th, 1967. The victim was 36-year-old Warless Jackson, who worked at the Armstrong Tire and Rubber Company plant in Natchez and was secretary of the Natchez NAACP. Jackson was killed when a bomb which had been planted in his pickup truck went off, and it's believed this occurred because he had recently received a promotion at Armstrong into a position which had previously only been held by white men. Once again, even though Jackson's murder was never officially solved, the Silver Dollar Group was believed to be responsible, and Red Glover, who also worked at the Armstrong plant, was considered to be the lead suspect. It was when the FBI investigated this particular case that they felt compelled to take a fresh look at Joe Ed's disappearance. It's obvious that the Silver Dollar Group were responsible for a number of murders, and the fact that the group was formed by people who believed that the KKK was no longer violent enough really tells you everything you need to know about them. Of course, one of the most terrifying aspects of these crimes is that local law enforcement was complicit and sometimes even directly involved. In particular, Frank DeLauder sounds like one of the most evil, bigoted, and sadistic people to have ever held a badge. I mentioned earlier that Joe Ed's cousin, Carl Ray Thompson, shared a story about personally witnessing DeLauder brutally assault 3 of his friends while they were at the city jail, but it sounds like this was par for the course with DeLauder, as if you research his history, you will find countless stories of him beating and torturing African Americans while they were in his custody, and some of them were completely innocent people who did nothing wrong and were falsely accused of crimes they did not commit. In 1972, DeLauder was sentenced to 1 year in prison for racketeering and violating the civil rights of a suspect he assaulted while in custody. When he was paroled, one of the conditions was that he could no longer hold a law enforcement position or carry a firearm, but he never faced charges for any murders he was linked to before he died in 1996. Now, of course, I've already mentioned the murder of Emmett Till numerous times, and as I'm sure you know, the incident which supposedly led to his death is when the wife of one of the two men who killed him accused Till of making advances towards her, though many years later, she admitted that she completely fabricated most of her claims. Here, we have rumors that Joseph Edwards was murdered because he attempted to kiss a white woman, Iona Perry, but the key difference is that she may have actually been telling the truth. However, even though Perry declined to press charges and seemed content to move on from the incident, that certainly wasn't going to stop a racist lynch mob from using this as justification to commit murder. On the other hand, there were so many different rumors surrounding Joe Ed and his alleged activities with white women that it's possible a decision had already been made to kill him before the kissing incident even took place. If you search online, the notice to close file for this case is available at the Department of Justice website, and it contains all the information that was uncovered during the various investigations. But reading through the whole thing, it's sometimes a challenge to separate fact from fiction, as it contains details from interviews with a number of different eyewitnesses, and they sometimes completely contradict each other. In fact, they even mention that some of the statements shared during interviews in Stanley Nelson's articles from the Concordial Sentinel contradicts information from the original FBI investigation, though these inconsistencies may have been caused by the passage of time. A number of the stories people shared were unconfirmed rumors and hearsay, and there's a good chance that the responsible parties intentionally spread false information throughout the community in order to taint the victim's reputation. But here's what we do know about the timeline. The last confirmed sighting of Joe Ed was shortly after midnight on July the 12th by an employee at the Shamrock Motel. Even though he was not scheduled to work that night, he was reportedly seen there at around 11 p.m., and rumor has it that he was meeting a white woman. Joe Ed reportedly said this himself at a bar earlier that evening, but what I find odd is that he said it to the father of his fiancée, and I'm not sure why Joe Ed would openly admit that he was planning to cheat on the guy's daughter. Whatever the case, after Joe Ed was seen leaving the Shamrock, we have the subsequent sighting from Kenneth Stevenson of Joe Ed's Buick parked on the side of the Vidalia Highway with a white Oldsmobile behind it. Stevenson said he saw a white male in the Oldsmobile driver's seat, two white males standing next to the Buick, and someone else in the Buick's driver's seat, though he cannot say with 100% certainty if it was Joe Ed. Stevenson claimed that shortly after he drove by them, the Oldsmobile caught up from behind and passed him by. So if Joe Ed had been inside the Buick, then that probably means he was abducted at that very moment. Since the Oldsmobile had a red light on the dashboard and appeared to be an unmarked police car, it's easy to assume that Joe Ed had been pulled over, but Stevenson's sighting took place at around 1:30 a.m., and Joe Ed was seen leaving the motel at around midnight, and the two locations are only about 10 miles apart. So perhaps something already happened to Joe Ed beforehand, and those other men were purposely abandoning the Buick next to the highway. Now, Stevenson did not recognize any of these white males, though he described the man inside the Oldsmobile as overweight. Out of the 7 suspects named by the Department of Justice decades later, Frank DeLauder, Bud Spinks, and James Buford Goss would have fit that description, since they all weighed between 240 and 265 pounds. Stevenson knew DeLauder personally and did not believe it was him, but I think there's a good chance that it might have been Spinks, since he was the Vidalia police chief, and the Oldsmobile resembled a vehicle his department was using at that time. While Stevenson did not believe the department's Oldsmobile was the same one he saw, it's worth noting that Red Glover had purchased a white 1964 Oldsmobile of his own just months earlier, and if a portable flashing red light was mounted on its dashboard, it could have easily been passed off as a police car. Another point of interest is how Ogden apparently once told someone a story about how both he and DeLauder had pulled over Joe Ed's Buick, but Joe Ed fled the scene on foot and disappeared. It's almost like Ogden had a cover story in place on the chance that someone had seen him outside the Buick that night. Now, there's additional confusion with the Buick because it apparently sat by the highway for several days before someone moved it to a side street, and some witnesses reported seeing things inside the car which were not present when it was examined by police. There was a belt and necktie in the vehicle which supposedly did not belong to Joe Ed, as his sister would later claim that she never saw him wear a necktie in his life, but at one point, the tie was reportedly on the steering wheel in the form of a noose, which may have been done to send a message, and frighten people who stumbled across the car while it was parked there. One witness also reported seeing a spot of blood on the floor, which was no longer there when the Buick was found, but given that the vehicle was moved, someone could have easily cleaned it up. It's interesting how the witness specifically described it as a quote-unquote silver dollar-sized pool of blood. Was that choice of words nothing more than a coincidence? Or did the Silver Dollar Club do that intentionally in order to send a message? Whatever the case, it's very clear that something happened to Joe Ed shortly after he left the Shamrock. It was never conclusively established what Joe Ed was doing at the motel, as investigators could not find any white women who admitted to being there with him that night, though given the racial tension at the time, I think that's something they would have kept to themselves if it was true. Like I mentioned earlier, the most prevalent rumor is that Joe Ed's murder was set in motion after he allegedly tried to kiss Iona Perry, and James Buford Goss filed a complaint with the Vidalia Police Department. But it's also been speculated that the inciting incident may have occurred weeks earlier when the 4-year-old son of a white sex worker drowned in the Shamrock's pool. Reading about this incident in the DOJ report was incredibly frustrating, since it sounds like there are so many different versions of what actually happened. We have rumors that Joe Ed and the child's mother were having sex in one of the rooms when the boy drowned, so therefore, Joe Ed could have been deemed to be responsible for the tragedy and murdered for it. However, we have other eyewitnesses placing the mother at the pool or at a service station when the drowning occurred, and even though one version of the story is that Joe Ed jumped into the pool and attempted to save the child, some witnesses seem to believe that this was an entirely different black employee who worked in the Shamrock's kitchen, and Joe Ed may not have even been there. But what is known is that Deputy Bill Ogden arrived at the scene that day when the police were brought in, and during an interview with the FBI, he admitted that he became acquainted with Joe Ed that day, so perhaps this is when he first set his sights on him. And of course, there were also uncorroborated rumors that Joe Ed was involved in a prostitution ring at the Shamrock, and may have even been pimping out white women, including the aforementioned sex worker whose child drowned, which I'm sure would have drawn the wrath of many people, if true. But remember, this is also a situation where people in positions of authority were believed to be responsible for Joe Ed's disappearance, so they would have been able to control the narrative and spread false rumors in order to make people believe that he deserved what happened to him. My issue with a lot of these rumors is that Joe Ed had only been working at the Shamrock for a month before he went missing, so would someone who was there for such a short time really be given the responsibility of setting up sex workers with motel guests? Even though Joe Ed was allegedly being paid to transport sex workers from a brothel in Natchez to the Shamrock, the madam at this brothel would tell the FBI that she did not know him. Well, it also turned out that there was another African-American porter who worked at the Shamrock prior to Joe Ed, and he would later admit that he sometimes obtained sex workers for guests. So perhaps this might be where some of the confusion stemmed from. Now, when the Department of Justice completed their investigation in 2013, they expressed their belief that at least 7 people had some sort of involvement with what happened to Joe Ed, and they were willing to name them publicly, even though they were all deceased by that point. I have no trouble believing that the 3 men named who were part of the Silver Dollar Group, Red Glover, Buck Horton, and Kenneth Norman Head, helped orchestrate this whole thing. Given that the Shamrock was one of the group's main hangouts, they definitely would have been privy to any personal business taking place there involving Joe Ed. The 2 white males Kenneth Stevenson saw outside Joe Ed's Buick were dressed in civilian clothes, so there's a good chance that one or more of them may have been Glover, Horton, or Head. And of course, even though they worked as sheriff's deputies, Frank DeLauder and Bill Ogden were known to be involved with the Silver Dollar Group and had a history of inflicting violence on black residents. It definitely seems certain that they were both involved and would have been able to instill enough fear in the community for people to keep their mouths shut and not ask questions. Now, in regards to Vidalia Police Chief Bill Spinks, I don't believe it was ever officially confirmed that he was affiliated with the Silver Dollar Group, and he did work for a completely different department than DeLauder and Ogden. There is a good chance that Spinks was the heavy-set white male seen in the Oldsmobile, but it's possible that he was not directly involved in Joe Ed's murder. Even so, I think it's pretty obvious that Spinks had culpability, and was likely the person who took the matter to the Silver Dollar Group to begin with. Remember, when he visited Iona Perry and she said she did not want to press charges against Joe Ed, Spinks allegedly told her that he, quote-unquote, would be taken care of. So at the very least, Spinks knew exactly what was going to happen. Keep in mind, given the local police's history of abusing black suspects in custody, even if Perry did file charges against Joe Ed and he was formally arrested, I'm sure they still would have made it a living hell for him. Now, the actual culpability of James Buford Goss might be a little bit more murky. Goss's daughter has claimed that prior to his death in 2009, her father often spoke about Concordia Parish and used the words, quote-unquote, those bastards, to describe DeLauder and Ogden, as he always maintained that they tried to pin Joe Ed's murder on him and would have made him a scapegoat if things went wrong. By Goss's own admission, when he learned about Joe Ed's alleged attempt to kiss Iona Perry, he intended to beat up Joe Ed himself and only went to the police when he could not find him. I guess it's possible this is where Goss's involvement with the matter ended, because remember, he did not actually live in Concordia Parish. He always maintained that after reporting the incident to Chief Spinks, he left the area and spent the weekend staying with his parents in the town of Ruston. But once again, even if Goss was not directly involved or present when the murder took place, he may have known exactly what was going to happen and did nothing to stop it. So while it's an absolute certainty that Joe Ed was murdered by these people, the manner in which it happened and the location where they disposed of his remains is still unclear. There were definitely some horrific stories which circulated throughout the area, such as Joe Ed being skinned alive or taken to a homemade torture chamber. I guess the best case scenario is that a lot of these rumors were exaggerated in order to instill fear in the community and prevent people from taking action. But when you read some of the truly barbaric stories of how African American victims were lynched and murdered during this time period, it's obvious that the cruelty of hate crimes committed by racists when they believe they'll never face any consequences for their actions knows no bounds. Now, it's been speculated that the quote-unquote flesh-like matter found submerged inside an icebox in Deer Park Lake by a fisherman in the fall of 1964 might have been Joe Ed's remains, but unfortunately, it went missing after it was turned over to the police. You could interpret this as them destroying evidence, but remember, it was turned over to the Catahoula Parish Sheriff's Office, not the Concordia Parish Sheriff's Office. In fact, the fisherman even said that he did this intentionally because he did not trust Concordia Parish. They obviously were not considering the possibility of DNA testing back in 1964, so they may have just concluded that it was animal flesh and thrown it away because it smelled so rancid. I know the FBI couldn't find the icebox when they performed a scuba operation in the lake 3 years later, but the water was apparently quite murky and filled with debris, making it difficult to navigate, so that doesn't necessarily mean that someone moved the evidence. However, given that Deer Park Lake was located 15 miles away from Vidalia, I'm actually inclined to think that the perpetrators wouldn't have traveled that far to dispose of Joe Ed's remains, especially since the local authorities would have had more control if the remains were found in their area. I know there were rumors that Joe Ed's remains were disposed of inside a large fishing hole just outside of Faraday, but I'm not sure if this hole was ever searched, or if it even still exists today. Anyway, since the Department of Justice sent Joe Ed's surviving relatives a letter of closure in 2013, that officially means that nothing else will come of this investigation. I mean, it was pretty much a certainty that no one would face justice for this crime, since all of the alleged perpetrators are dead, but I'm sure it was still incredibly frustrating for them. Not only is there little chance of recovering Joad's remains and giving him a proper burial, but there's still no conclusive answers about what exactly happened to him or why it happened. After all, Joad's family have had to listen to a number of rumors about him these past 56 years, but if the actual truth came out, perhaps some of the unflattering things which have been said about him, such as the allegations of him pimping out women, can finally be put to rest. Enough of Joad's friends and family have personally confirmed that he did like to involve himself with white women, so I think there is probably some truth to that. But regardless, even if he really did make an unwanted advance on Iona Perry and tried to kiss her, that certainly does not justify what ultimately happened to him, and this is just yet another example of racist people finding an excuse to justify their need to inflict violence on individuals they hate because of their skin color. This whole story is just a horrible injustice, and it's a travesty that the responsible parties got to live long lives without even facing any real consequences. And because some of those people were police officers, they got to use their power to hold a reign of terror over the community and inflict many horrible acts of violence on persons of color. I mentioned earlier that Concordia Parish had a total of 14 known racially motivated murders between 1964 and 1967, but I think the scary word here is known. How many more murders and acts of violence took place during that time period which were never recorded and are now lost to history? This is why I think it's important that stories like Joseph Edwards's are never forgotten. Anyway, even though this investigation is officially closed and no one will ever be charged, this is technically still a missing persons case, so the one way in which there's a slim chance of resolution is if Joad's remains can be recovered. So if by chance you happen to have any information on the final resting place of Joseph Edwards, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released an episode about the bizarre story of Jody Roberts, who went missing from Washington State in 1985 before she was discovered to be alive and living under a new identity 12 years later after suffering an apparent case of amnesia. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Joe E., Betty S., Tony R., Donna B., Liz W., Curtis M., Christy E., and Ariel W. Thank you all so much for your support. And I'd also like to remind everyone that this coming Saturday, June the 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we will be having another one of our Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathons, in which we'll be screening segments from the show about cases which have been featured on The Trail Went Cold. We're doing this in anticipation of the Unsolved Mysteries revival, which is launching on Netflix next week, and you can join us for this live watch of some classic segments and get the chance to chat with myself and your fellow listeners while you watch them. Once again, it takes place this coming Saturday, June the 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You can find a link to the screening room in our show notes, and it's also pinned to the top of our Facebook and Twitter pages. Anyway, I'd also like to take a moment to play a promo for another true crime podcast called Mourning the Murdered.
Mourning the Murdered is a podcast I created because in 1999, a friend of mine was murdered. My name is Kelly, and I am your host. I saw the effects that murder have on family members, and I wanted to give a voice to the loved ones of murdered victims. Every week, I interview the family member of a murder victim. So please be sure to tune in every Thursday to hear their stories on Mourning the Murdered podcast.
And before we bring this episode to a close, I have a request from a listener named Vidalia, whose mother is celebrating her birthday today. So on behalf of The Trail Went Cold, happy birthday, Michelle Banks. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. Like I mentioned in the intro, our podcast is going to be spending this month exclusively releasing episodes about cold cases in which the victims were persons of color. Next Wednesday just happens to be July the 1st, which is Canada Day, so that is going to be part of the theme for next week's episode. So I hope that everyone stays safe and has a good week, and we'll see you next Wednesday for another brand new edition of The Trail Went Cold.